The Rat Problem by SublimeCloud. When I was young, I lived in an old house. It was built in the 1890s, and for most of its existence, it had served as a small maternity hospital. As a child, it was strange to know that so many lives had begun in my own home. That included my own life, as I was born in the room that later became my bedroom. I was a restless child. I made my parents worry as I was often getting into places I shouldn't and hurting myself doing silly things. My biggest problem, though, was that I refused to go to bed when I was told. Despite my parents' best efforts, I would sneak out of my room and into our playroom, into their bedroom, and into my brother's room almost every night. I have vivid memories of hating going to sleep in my own bed. I didn't want to sleep knowing everyone else was still awake. I guess that is just the way it is when you are the youngest child. Because the house was so old, it had quite a few parts that weren't in the best condition. The pavers outside were cracked, the weatherboard on the outside was peeling its paint, and there were rats living all over the property, especially in the outdoor dunny in the roof. The house didn't have an attic, but there was a crawl space between the ceiling of the house and the tin roof, which was where there were colonies of rats. We could hear them at night, and that was the biggest reason I hated sleeping in my room. The noise of the rats seemed much louder in my room than other rooms in the house. My parents laid out traps for them, but due to an unusual roof design, only half of the roof could be accessed by the main manhole, and the secondary manhole, which was in the corner of my ceiling, never opened no matter how hard my parents pushed. By the time I was 5, I had become aware of the loud noises coming from above my room. I told my parents I didn't like the noise of the rats, and for a few years they allowed me to sleep in my brother's room, on his bunk bed. However, as we grew older, my brother didn't want me in his room. Looking back, it wasn't unreasonable. I'd slept on his bottom bunk for 3 years, and he was almost 12 years old. By now, I was 8, and my parents decided it was time for me to have my own room again. My first night in the room, I lay awake for hours, listening to the scratching and rustling sounds coming from my ceiling. I told my parents the next morning, and they laid out even more traps. They even called an exterminator to see if there were possums or larger pests, but the company told them they had only found evidence of rats. It was only another week after that I was complaining again. More traps went out, more exterminators were called, and still no explanation for the ridiculously loud scratching noises in my ceiling. After a few months of this, my parents decided they would deal with the problem once and for all. They were sick and tired of dealing with me being cranky and scared of my own room, so they called a friend who worked as a construction worker and decided to get the manhole in my bedroom open using power tools and clear out all of the rats. They broke into the roof on a Wednesday morning while my brother and I were at school, so that we wouldn't be in the way. That day was the first day that I was excited to sleep in my room. But as it turned out, I wouldn't get the chance. When my mother picked me up from school, she had several large bags with her, and she took me and my brother to our grandparents' house. She said we would stay there for a few days while her and my father sorted some things out. After that, we never went back to the house. The house we moved into was newer than our old one, and only had one manhole into the roof. Before we moved in, my father combed through the crawl space, although at the time I wasn't sure why. I just thought he was putting out traps for the rats like he used to at our old house. Although at this new house, I never heard rats in the roof. When I was 18, I was joking about the rat problem we used to have at our old house when my parents finally came clean. Upon breaking into the crawl space above my bedroom, they had uncovered a gruesome collection of tiny skeletons. They were the corpses of newborn babies that had died there while the house was still a maternity hospital. And although it was clear there had been attempts to preserve them, some were in little boxes, some were wrapped in cloth. The rats had broken in and eaten the little things clean of all of their flesh. An unholy stench had greeted them upon cracking open the crawl space. But the worst part about it was that there had been rats breeding inside the bodies of those dead infants, and literally thousands of rat skeletons and dead rats were littered everywhere. My parents never found out why the bodies of nearly 30 newborn babies had been stuffed into the roof of the maternity hospital, but the bodies of those poor babies had fed a plague of rats. What still disturbs me to this day was that all of the rats in the crawl space were already dead. We still have no idea what was making so much noise above my room. My parents think the dead rats had become a food source for others, and that they had fled when the manhole was opened, but I never really believed them. Nevertheless, to this day, I have an intense fear of rodents, and I refuse to enter the roof of any house.